Good afternoon to all. On behalf of the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, I welcome you all to today's program on thrombophilia and preeclampsia, evidence versus practice. I further welcome Dr. Chaitra for the further proceedings of the session. Dr. Chaitra has done her MS OBG from Mysore Medical College and got the fellowship in maternal fetal medicine from Milan. She is presently working as an assistant professor at BGS Global Institute of Medical Sciences in Bangalore. Dr. Chaitra has completed her MRCOG and worked in UK for a period of 2 years. Her main areas of interest include medical disorders in pregnancy, critical care in obstetrics. Dr. Chaitra is also EC member of SMFMI. Dr. Chaitra, I welcome you to the program.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mahesh. And on this occasion, on behalf of Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, I welcome this August gathering to the second virtual learning series on preeclampsia, which is still considered a mysterious and a multi-system disorder. In today's world, with almost everything happening online, the key word is probably send me the link. What's the link which I have to access? Today, our focus will be on an important link, and that link is the link between thrombophilia and preeclampsia. I'm sure all of you are eagerly awaiting this panel discussion, which has a host of very eminent speakers, panelists, and the moderators. Also, this will be followed by an insight into our very prestigious project, Preeclampsia Education of the Nation India, or the PENAI. To welcome this August gathering, I would like to request the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine's President, Dr. Prakash Mehta, sir, to take over, before which I would like to speak a few words about sir, who's been our mentor throughout our journey in maternal fetal medicine. Dr. Prakash K. Mehta is the Chief, Division of Maternal Fetal Medicine and Head of the Department of OBGYN at Bhagwan Mahavir Jain Hospital, Bangalore. He is a very popular postgraduate and post-PG fellowship teacher. He has several articles, chapters, and has delivered several orations in the field of maternal fetal medicine. He is presently the president of SMFMI. He is the past president of BSOG, past joint secretary of FOXI, and the honorary secretary of ANVI. He has several awards to his credit, and we all are testimonials to that. He has also received the Lifetime Achievement Award in BSOG 2021. I request, sir, to welcome the gathering and take it forward.
Thank you, Chaitra. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome all our gathering to this meeting of SMFMI. Now, incidentally, this happens to be the 7th meeting for the year 2021 and 23rd meeting of SMFMI since the 2 years that we have been in existence. We have had 5 international meetings since we started the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine. And today it's another special privilege for me to welcome, like for example, in the last 2 months, we have had about 21 new members joining the society. And I take this opportunity to welcome them to the society and to our academic feasts. Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine India came up with the PENAI program, that is the Preeclampsia Education of the Nation India program, wherein we have faculty from all over the world, including who's who in any particular field of preeclampsia. We have the likes of Dr. Laura Maggie, Dr. Sarosh Rana, Dr. Michael Gravett, Dr. Leona Poon, and of course from India we have Dr. Alpesh Gandhi, Dr. Sanjay Gupte, Dr. Suchitra Pandit, Dr. Girija Bhag, and of course our very own, starting from myself to Revati to quite a few of our concept builders from the local society. This program has been in existence now for about 2 months, and already the first batch is full, and even in the first batch, at least 3 students have already cleared the exam. We have kept a very high bar. You have to get 75% in your assessment exam to get the certification. And this certification is issued both by SMFMI as well as the International Society for Hypertension. I'm sure all of you know that the International Society for Hypertension is the society that defines preeclampsia, and it is one of the most prestigious societies in the world. So this certificate is jointly issued by both these societies, and possibly at the end of this program, after we have finished the panel, we are going to have a short introduction to PENAI, as well as to how the PENAI program was made. I'm very glad again to announce that while we are so far restricted to India, we have had candidates from all over India. We are very soon going to Haiti and also to Asia Oceania. We would have started in Haiti by now, but unfortunately the earthquake in Haiti created a little bit of backlog there. So, but I'm very sure the next couple of months we should be able to go to Haiti. I've told all my team members to start learning a little bit of Creole so that they can interact with the Haitians. So we hope that this program saves at least a few women with preeclampsia somewhere in the world. And then all the efforts that we have put into this program would be worthwhile. The other important thing from the society that is coming up is a book on preeclampsia. We are hoping to have about 50 chapters in this book on preeclampsia. And this will be in association with the International Society of Obstetric Medicine from USA. So jointly, SMFMI and ICOM will make this program for the book with American authors and Indian authors. And we again hope that this book will help in managing our preeclampsias much better, not only just in India, but anywhere in the world, because we are going to have both the absolutely state of art plus the minimum consideration that are required for management of any preeclamptic patient. With this, Chaitra, thank you very much again. And I think, Dr. Revati, we are ready to start the panel.
Thank you, sir. We would now straight zoom into the panel. I would request all of you to sit back and enjoy this academic feast. I would like to introduce the moderators for the panel, Dr. Prakash Mehta, sir, and Dr. Revati Rajan. Dr. Revati Rajan,
just a minute.
Yeah, no problem, is the Chief Consultant, Maternal and Fetal Medicine, and the Managing Director of Mirror Health, Bangalore. She is the present Secretary of the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, India. She is the co-chair, the Indian co-chair of PENAI. She is also the Executive Editor of the Pan-Asian Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. She's been elected as the Executive Committee member of BSOG, and she has been the Organizing Secretary of Live Conference 2019. Always booming with a lot of energy and motivating everybody to be a part of this project. That's Dr. Revati. She also has several awards to her credit, the Yuva Foxy Award, and she has several publications. Her special interest, of course, is hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. With this, I would now move on to introduce our eminent panelists. Dr. Jayanti T, and I really would like to say that these eminent panelists have been so modest in giving us a very small CV, but the moment you listen to them, they will speak volumes about the work they have done. So Dr. Jayanti T, we welcome you today as one of our panelists. She is the Professor and HOD, Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, KIMS, Bangalore, and she has been a favorite past president of BSOG. We welcome you, ma'am. Dr. Shobha Goody, she is the Professor and Head of the Department of St. Philomena's Hospital, Bangalore, and a very popular postgraduate teacher and examiner. She's the chairperson of FWC Foxy 1920-21, President BSOG 2018 to 2019, assessor of the GOI project Lakshya, and a board member of FPAI, peer reviewer of Jogi, and the EC member of Kasoga. She is the editor of The Obstetrics Hemorrhage, and she has several publications, national and international, to her credit, and several awards. We welcome you, ma'am, for the panel. Our next panelist is Dr. Sunita. She had an undergraduate degree from Bangalore Medical College and completed her DGO from MS Ramaya. She has done her fellowship in maternal fetal medicine from Bangalore Assisted Conception Center of Milan. And she is currently a feto-maternal consultant at Milan and the managing director at Jayanagar branch. And she's keenly having interest on managing high-risk ART preconceptions and women with recurrent pregnancy loss. She is also the EC member of SMFMI and BSOG. I heartily welcome you, ma'am, for this panel.
Thank you, Dr. Chaitra.
We also have Dr. Lata. Could I have the next slide, please?
Yeah, it's on.
So Dr. Lata Chaturvedula, she is the professor and head of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the prestigious JIPMER Pondicherry Institute, and she's the resource person in medical education at JIPMER Pondicherry. We heartily welcome you, ma'am, for this panel. Next slide, please. So with this, I would request our moderators, Dr. Prakash Mehta sir and Dr. Revati, to take us through this interesting panel on thrombophilia and preeclampsia.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we start again with the panel. When we were trying to choose what topic to take, then we zeroed down on this thrombophilia and preeclampsia because we know that they are related, but we don't know how they are related, how much they are related, and a lot of confusions. When do we do the test for thrombophilia? Should we be doing it at all? And if I do a test and I get some result, what do I do with that result? And and whom do I do the test? Just because somebody has a preeclampsia, should I do a thrombophilia profile on her? Because quite a few of our preeclampic patients are not economically so well-to-do, and thrombophilia screening does cost a lot of money. So we have to be very judicious in ordering this test. And to clear all our doubts today, we have an eminent set of panelists. I must tell the audience that all these people are extremely, extremely busy. They are on webinars all the time, apart from their clinical work and all the other work. All the ladies have to do multitasking. But I have to thank them because one phone call and everybody accepted our invitation to share their expertise with our audience today. So welcome again, Dr. Jayanti, Dr. Lata, Dr. Shobha, and Dr. Sunita. Nice to have you on the panel, and I'm sure our delegates will learn a lot from today's panel and go. Next slide, please. Now, we know that there are various etiological theories of preeclampsia. We know that there could be an abnormal or increased immune response. We know that there could be an endothelial cell injury. There could be a genetic predisposition. There could be an abnormal angiogenesis. And also there could be abnormal coagulation or thrombophilia. Now, how do these various etiologies meet each other? And how do they cause their effects is what we'll try to understand today. Next slide, please. Now, before we go further, let us just cover a little bit of basics so that, I'm sure we have a lot of postgraduates on this program. So let us understand what we are discussing about. The first question will go to Dr. Lata. What is thrombophilia?
Okay, basically when we talk about thrombophilias, we always talk about some kind of coagulation which is occurring inside in the vasculature, which again, kind of prevents, it blocks the vessels, and there is development of hypertension. And also because there is decrease in uteroplacental blood flow, then what happens is the fetuses are affected in some way or other. So that is something, and of course they are at a higher risk of, as I said, coagulation, and this is called as thrombosis. So that's what will happen in thrombophilias. So we'll have to find out whether we could prevent it, whether, as you said, whether it could be always preventable, whether we need to investigate everyone or not. I think as we go down, we'll listen to it.
Yeah, sure. As we go down, we'll discuss it. Whom should we investigate and how much should we investigate? The biggest problem with thrombophilia is that between thrombophilia and immune causes, there is so much of overlap because we all know anticardiolipin antibodies very well, which causes both thrombophilia and is immune in nature, that people tend to confuse thrombophilia with immune disorders. Please remember, these are two different set of disorders requiring quite often two different set of therapies. Next slide, please. So with that, we go to Dr. Jayanti. Dr. Jayanti, what are the various types of thrombophilias that we can come across?
We have both inherited as well as acquired thrombophilias. So inherited thrombophilias usually, we know that it's protein S deficiency, protein C deficiency, and factor V and all those. Among the acquired, we have various, and the most important is the antiphospholipid syndrome, antibody syndrome, and of course hyperhomocystinemia. So only difference between these two is when they have inherited thrombophilias, the occurrence of thromboembolism is earlier compared to the inherited ones. Sorry, compared to the acquired ones. So that's the main difference.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jayanti. I think so. We have to keep both kinds of thrombophilias in mind, both inherited and acquired.
Yeah.
Now, among the acquired, antiphospholipid antibody is the most common acquired thrombophilic disorder. That's where what I told you, the conflict between immunological and thrombophilic etiologies come into being. The most common hereditary thrombophilic disorder is factor V Leiden. Now, for a long time, it was believed that factor V Leiden is a disorder of whites, and then that in India, we don't need to worry about factor V Leiden mutation. But the more and more we started investigating, for example, in my hospital, we have a very strong department of vascular surgery, and we get a lot of deep vein thrombosis patients. And when we started investigating them, we found that factor V Leiden was not as rare as we presumed it to be. So please keep that disorder in mind. As far as obstetrics is concerned, another two important points are the protein C and protein S, which are the vitamin K dependent plasma proteins. I'm sure our panelists will tell us when we go to the investigations as to when you would want to do a protein C and protein S estimation. Would it be of importance in pregnancy or not? Or should we do it in an interval period? I'm sure we'll cover it down the road. Next slide, please. So basically, we have the difference between normal coagulation and the thrombophilia. We know that prothrombin, thrombin, and then finally the coagulation occurs. But in thrombophilia, there are various factors influencing the conversion of prothrombin to thrombin and from thrombin to the actual thrombosis. So you could see that it could be an activated protein C resistance, it could be a factor V deficiency, it could be a prothrombin mutation, and so on. Next slide, please. So next to Dr. Shobha Gudi, is there a relationship between thrombophilia and preeclampsia? Is there really a relationship, or are we just trying to build up a relationship where nothing exists?
No, I wouldn't say that we are trying to build up. There is a relationship, but whether it is an association or a cause and effect, probably that remains an open question. But then we do find that placental pathology is there. It exists in preeclampsia also, and in women who are afflicted with APLA also. And at times we do see placental pathology in women with congenital thrombophilia also. So I would say that we need to look out for preeclampsia in women who have these conditions. The vice versa is also true. Women who develop early onset preeclampsia, we need to look for, especially for APLA syndrome, not so much congenital thrombophilia, but APLA syndrome. So there is an association. A cause and effect still needs to be very well established. It's not that well established.
Okay, now this is one of the from one of the articles of 2020, where it was found that the placental hypoxia effect on the trophoblast, and then it brings in what is called as HMGB1, that is the high mobility group POX1, it is called, and that acts on the maternal endothelial cells and releases the microparticles, which in turn causes blood coagulation and leukocyte activation, ultimately resulting in endothelial damage. Now, whether this blood coagulation is increased because of thrombophilia is what we need to study further. And if by using anticoagulants, if we can stop this blood coagulation, then probably our preeclampsias could be milder or even coming in a little later. So this is open for still a lot more research to be going into it. Next slide, please. So it was in 1989 that for the first time, Branch reported an association between the APLA syndrome and the severe preeclampsia less than 34 weeks of gestation. The association between inherited thrombophilias and preeclampsias was reported by Decker in 1995. So we are, trying to decipher what has been happening with coagulation and preeclampsia for now almost 25 years, but still we are much away from the answer. Since then, numerous retrospective and case control studies have assessed the incidence of thrombophilias in women with severe preeclampsia. And what has been found from all the articles put together, meta-analysis, has been found that the factor V Leiden occurs from 3.7 to 26.5% of the patients, depending on the population that you're studying. prothrombin gene mutation up to 10%, protein S deficiency could go up to 25%, and MTHFR variant could be that is the one involved in the hyperhomocystinemia, could go up to 24% in the patients. So there is some relation, but how much it is, what it is, I'm sure as we go through the cases, our panelists will be able to tell us better. Next slide, please. So with this, I request Dr. Revati to take over and start the cases, please.
Thank you so much, sir. So we have two interesting and important cases to be discussed. So case 1, we have a 26-year-old para 1, live 0, abortion 1, who presented to the maternal fetal medicine OPD with history of eclampsia and intrauterine fetal demise at 30 weeks about 6 months ago. She is a known case of polycystic ovarian syndrome with irregular menses, and she's married for 5 years. She currently needs preconceptional evaluation. Now, relevant obstetric history, she is para 1, live 0, abortion 1, both managed outside the maternal fetal medicine unit. First abortion, she had conceived naturally after 2 years of marriage. Early pregnancy scan at 8 weeks confirmed missed abortion. The termination of pregnancy was done medically, and check scan confirmed completeness. Second pregnancy, she conceived after ovulation induction, irregular antenatal visits, missed her anti-scan. Scan at 18 weeks showed features of early onset fetal growth restriction with high uterine artery Doppler mean PI. There were no associated structural defects. Blood pressure monitoring records not available. Blood sugars were normal as per verbal claims of the patient. Patient further dropped out of regular surveillance and encountered the obstetrician only at 29 weeks of gestation with history of headache since 2 days. Blood pressure measured was 210 by 110 mmHg at that point of time, and she was advised immediate admission for evaluation, which the patient promptly refused and traveled to her hometown by train only to throw a seizure at a government hospital. The scan confirmed IUFT with possible severe FGR. Patient was stabilized with antihypertensives and Maxulf with a working diagnosis of eclampsia, and later she was induced and delivered, boy baby, birth weight of 860 grams with no obvious morphological defects. This was picked up from the discharge summary. She required blood transfusion in view of superimposed HELLP syndrome and was discharged with antihypertensives, which the patient claims to have stopped after 1 month of delivery, as according to her, the BP had normalized. She did not meet her obstetrician again, only to consult the maternal fetal medicine OPD after being counseled by a friend to do so in view of her bad obstetric history. Relevant clinical information, her BMI currently is 31, her BP of 130 by 86 at mmHg at presentation, her fasting blood sugar is 110 milligrams per deciliter, HbA1c of 6.5%, her TSH is 3.86 micro international units per liter, CBC and urine routine micro was within normal limits. Lipid profile, borderline high triglycerides, 168 milligrams per deciliter. This was done in view of her BMI. Blood group is B positive. Ultrasound, abdomen and pelvis confirmed PCO with no other contributory findings. No other contributory medical or family history as per the patient. This question is to Dr. Lata. Madam, would you want to evaluate for thrombophilia? What test would you advise?
This patient, if you look at the history, she has had an early onset preeclampsia previously, and first was a missed abortion. Both go in favor of definitely ruling out antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. But then before that, I would also, India being a diabetic center, I would also like to do a glucose tolerance test for her at this time, because hypertension is also more prone to develop in patients with diabetics. So those two I would definitely do. And if we'll do these simultaneously, and in antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, should be done, because if we diagnose it, then we can at least start her on low molecular weight heparin and aspirin, so as to prevent the recurrence. Early onset preeclampsia are very much prone to have antiphospholipid, rather the other way around. APLA syndrome, they develop early onset preeclampsia rather than late onset preeclampsia. Usually what we do is an anticardiolipin antibody, beta-2-glycoprotein and lupus anticoagulant. of course, first thing we look for is the anti-cardiolipin antibody. So that's what I would do first. If that is negative, maybe we can go for other things. But again, as Dr. Mehta had already said, protein S, protein C, how common they are, affordability, and all come, and factor V laden, all these, whether we should really do depends on if we don't find any other problem in these patients, any other this thing. But I would definitely not do as a primary thing. First thing, I would definitely rule out APLA if this GTT is negative. I mean, if she is not having a raised GTT. That these two are very important to be done in these patients first.
Absolutely, madam. I think you have comprehensively told us that looking at the history, you would definitely want to rule out APLA, but you should never forget that there could be other factors, especially in our country with metabolic syndrome on the rise, which needs to be taken care of. We have this revised 2016 SAPROS criteria, where we are looking at the lab criteria of which you have already quoted, the lupus anticoagulant being positive, the cardiolipin antibody, which again ACA, IgG, and IgM being positive, as well as beta-2 glycoprotein antibody, which is also being positive, which is more than the 99th centile for ELISA. Or if you want the numbers, it's usually the 40 GPLU units or the 40 MPLU units. And most of these definitions, especially the previous ones, which are not clinical, usually base it on the numbers. There must be a repeat test after 12 weeks, which confirms the test, along with either a thrombotic episode or pregnancy-related morbidity, which is unexplained miscarriage more than 10 weeks of gestation, premature birth before 34th week of gestation, or at least more than 3 unexplained consecutive miscarriages, which are less than 10 weeks of gestation. But as clinicians, we all know that most of these patients who have problems don't really fit into this definition, but they may have a thrombotic component. Unfortunately, we are not mapping all the antigens which could probably lead to thrombosis. Yeah. So I would want to actually bring about this EULAR recommendation, which is from Europe, which a set of rheumatologists who have actually put in a clinical definition where they have identified that we could probably do a lot of preventive work by identifying women who've had seropositive APS, with a relative who's had a thrombotic episode, and simultaneously we may have a lot of these patients with obstetric APS and are seronegative. And according to them, we can classify it as a high-risk APL or a medium high-risk APL and a low-risk APL. So not necessarily you may want to get the report after 12 weeks. You can have a medium high APL titer, which just says ACL of IgG or IgM either type, which is more than 40 GPLU or more than 40 MPLU. And that could be considered to be median high APL. And high risk is the typical one where you have the 2 occasions repeat positive titer, and a low risk APL, which may not be very significant, like an isolated beta-2 glycoprotein antibody in low medium titers, particularly if transiently positive. So these women may also be considered for prophylaxis if there is a clinical feature suggestive of APS in the family or in the patient herself. And as far as the obstetric APS is concerned, when there is a history of delivery of less than 34 weeks of gestation due to eclampsia or severe preeclampsia, like the patient that we have actually seen, you can administer low-dose aspirin or heparin at prophylactic dosage, considering the individual's risk profile, not necessarily if she's only seropositive. With a clinical non-criteria obstetric APS, which we commonly encounter, presence of 2 recurrent spontaneous miscarriages of less than 10 weeks, or delivery of more than 34 weeks due to severe preeclampsia, still these women can be considered for treatment with LDA alone or in combination with heparin. And this needs to be individualized after a lot of counseling. This is more preventive medicine. And with obstetric APS treated with prophylactic dose heparin during pregnancy, continuation of heparin at prophylactic dose for 6 weeks after delivery is very important to prevent thrombotic episodes.
Revati, can I make a point in the diagnosis? Can I make a point in the diagnosis slide, which you said? I think though our patients may not be able to afford, it is important to emphasize that all 3 testing will give a good, diagnostic pickup for us.
Yes.
One of the reasons being that though, anti-cardiolipin antibody is the most sensitive test out of the three. But then LA is more specific, and LA and a triple positive condition also gives a graver prognosis. Okay, so it's important to quantify the risk as well. So a complete profiling is preferable rather than doing any one test. The other thing is when to test for congenital thrombophilia. I think you gave some indicators, even Dr. Prakash gave. So when there is a family history of thrombotic episodes, especially in younger members of the first degree relatives or in the woman herself, it's very easy to miss a history of thrombotic episode in the past. So we must have a screening of all our pregnant women where we are trained to look for thrombotic episodes in the past. And such women may merit in the presence of bad obstetric history with congenital thrombophilia screen. Okay,
absolutely,
and yeah, in fact, I had one patient who had protein S deficiency, protein C deficiency. And believe me, in that couple, it was a consanguineous marriage, and we found early neonatal demise, not obstetric, not during pregnancy. We found early neonatal demise, and the babies were tested for, and they were found to have protein S deficiency. And correct, it was a recessive gene, and we put the couple through prenatal diagnosis. And subsequently, when it was tested negative, they continued and they finally had a normal baby. So I just wanted to share.
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
One more thing I would like to say, in this patient, like she has to come back after 6 weeks, and we won't wait for the next pregnancy to occur to do the screening for APLA, because again it's going to be the same thing. She may come back with missed abortion again. So in inter-pregnancy interval, she has to do, and that we need to counsel her before she becomes pregnant. And as you said, we also have given a lot of times the heparin and seronegative, and they have done well. Because many a time it's not really picked up, though the history is very typical of APLA.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
that's a very valid point.
Possibly because we don't look at all the
yes, that's true.
See, phosphatidylserine is now coming up in a big way, and we don't do a test for it.
Yeah.
So if there is something, I would say we have to individualize the patient, and I would rather err on giving her aspirin at least.
Aspirin, yes.
Yes, sir. And I think that is reiterated by the statement, sir. A lot of these people who are picked up to be positive because of a family history, they've told us that high-risk APL profile is definitely associated with greater risk for thrombotic and obstetric APS. Risk modification includes screening for and management of cardiovascular and venous thrombosis risk factors other than APLA, patient education about treatment adherence, as well as lifestyle counseling. So it has to be a lot of comprehensive screening and counseling with management to take forward these cases to prevent thrombosis. And a lot of emphasis now has been laid on preventive treatment, preventive strategies rather than only handling consequence management, sir. Now, in this patient, like how we discussed, yes, we did an APLA workup because she had come to an MFM OPD, and we had to counsel her. And we found that she was strongly positive for beta-2 glycoprotein IgG, 160.6 GPLU, which is very high, strong positive. She was also LA moderately positive. Protein C and protein S was done, which was negative. There was no hyperhomocystinemia, which was looked at, in the first trimester, in the interconceptional period. And she was also ANA negative.
Dr. Revati, I just want to say one more thing. Once you found that APL is the first thing which is done, if it is positive, is it really necessary to do protein C and protein S? Because anyway, we are going to do the treatment.
Yes, ma'am. There is some literature which says that people who have multiple positives on the thrombus, which can probably lead to thrombosis, they may require therapeutic doses of heparin, and they may be more potent candidates for thrombotic episodes postpartum as well. Yes, ma'am. After 6 weeks. So it is a lot of prognostication that goes in looking at the entire profile. But like how you said, we can't do it on every patient.
Everyone, yeah.
But if you can do it,
individualization is important. Individualization.
Yes, ma'am. So
one is individualization. Second is main thing is affordability.
Yes,
that is also.
You may also step up into therapeutic doses if they have multiple thrombophilias. This patient was counseled for repeat APLA testing after 12 weeks and was told to avoid pregnancy till further instructions, but patient returned with a positive urine pregnancy test and history of 3 months amenorrhea again. Scan confirmed single live intrauterine gestation of 6 weeks, 1 day. She had irregular periods with fetal heart rate of about 104 beats per minute with a small subchorionic hemorrhage. This question is for Dr. Jayanti. Madam, how would you manage the case? And could you please elaborate relevant points from counseling?
Yeah. So since here already one test we have done and she's pregnant, so we can't wait for another 6 weeks to confirm her diagnosis, right? So I think we should always think it's positive, and since because of the past history also, we should go ahead and start the treatment, especially the aspirin, low dose aspirin as well as low molecular weight heparin should be started. And we should counsel her stating that like the prognosis, even in spite of treatment, she can have complications, and she's a candidate for abortions, preeclampsia, and thromboembolism and all those things. And then of course we have to thyroid. I think already her thyroid is 3, so we have to start her on thyroxine. And here instead of 25, I think most of the endocrinologists say 25 is not enough even for the body weight. So ideal to give minimum of 50. That's what they recommend. So I think 50 micrograms will be better to supplement. Then of course HCQs can be given, and we have to screen them for diabetes because that's very common association with that, and also to prevent other problems. So since here HbA1c is 6.8, then of course we have to monitor sugars and 7-point sugars and adjust the insulin accordingly. And she has to be counseled that adherence for treatment follow-up is very, very important, and all the complications that could happen to her later.
Absolutely, ma'am. You have.
And what all we should tell her is that she should not go into dehydration, because dehydration precipitates thromboembolism, and we should ask her to be ambulative and never to be taking too much of rest. That's very important, because bed rest again is a factor which can precipitate thromboembolism. So we have to tell her to be ambulatory, to avoid dehydration, to take adequate fluids during pregnancy, and if she has prolonged traveling, she should consult the doctor to take advice about what medication she has to take. So all those advices have to be given.
Yes, madam. I think madam has actually comprehensively told all the points which we did to the patient. She was started on low molecular weight heparin, 40 milligrams once daily with HCQS.
The mic a little closer, please.
Yes, sir. And low dose aspirin was started, 150 milligrams. She was also put on B6, B12 and folic acid supplements. Her HbA1c was 6.8%. So she was advised 6-point blood sugar monitoring, and she was started on actrapid and insulatard combination. Her thyroid was 3 micro international units. She was started only on 25, and she was subject to titrations with close follow-up. Her blood pressure was incidentally found to be 140/90. So this was confirmed with repeat readings with intervals of 4 hours in between, and she was started with tablet labetalol, 100 milligrams, 1 in the morning, 1 in the night, as a diagnosis of chronic hypertension was made. Now, what are the counseling salients? I think madam has already summarized. We explained the implications of an unplanned pregnancy in the background of strongly positive APLA test being supported with previous bad obstetric history. We explained the need for low molecular weight heparin with low dose aspirin, as well as HCQS. I will show you a study where HCQS can go a long way in stabilization of endothelial function, so that the chances of them developing preeclampsia and fetal growth restriction could be lesser compared to those who have not been started, with appropriate titrations for optimizing obstetric outcomes. Need to manage concurrent medical derailments, very important, because it's not just isolated APLA. She was a case of PCOS, she was obese, so we had to look at other medical risk factors, which we explained to them. Need for close maternal and fetal surveillance, very, very important. She has to come to the OPD more frequently. Possibility of planning delivery in a tertiary unit with HDU and ICU as well as blood bank was also explained. We kept priming the patient from the first trimester itself. Now, further course, patient continued.
1 minute. I think we have had a very good point being told that don't use homeopathic doses of thyroxine in these patients. Give a proper dose. So I think Dr. Jayanti brought it out very well, and we need to keep that in mind.
Yes, sir. And they can be titrated also, sir. Yes. And further course, patient continued regular follow-ups in the maternal fetal medicine OPD. Periodic scans, blood tests, blood pressure, as well as blood sugar monitoring was performed, and appropriate titrations of medications done. She was on iron and calcium 1 gram per day supplements from the second trimester. NT scan with uterine artery Doppler screening, combined testing for aneuploidy, anomaly scan, and fetal echo were within normal limits. So she was immunomodulated well. Third trimester surveillance with interval growth scans and modified BPP was also initiated. Now, further course, patient complaints of decreased fetal movements for 1 day at 32 weeks and 6 days. NST showed normal baseline with average beat to beat and small accelerations. AFI was 13.6 centimeters, which is normal, and umbilical artery Doppler was within normal limits. BP and blood sugars were under control. Patient was counseled for prophylactic steroids for fetal lung maturity in view of her decreased fetal movement history. Patient refused admission and wanted to return the next day. On the next day, she continued to have subjectively less movements, less than 3/12 hours, in spite of good hydration and food intake, with NST showing poor beat-to-beat variability and few small accelerations. Growth scan with fetal Dopplers remained grossly normal. AFI showed a small decrease, but not a significant decrease, up to 12.07 centimeters. This is what typically happens in most of our OPDs. Second dose steroid was given. First dose was given the day before, but she did not want it under admission. PET profile was normal, except that platelet count was 1.56 lakhs per cubic millimeter. Explain need to monitor closely under admission versus imminent delivery if the fetal movements continue to be less or if NST worsens in view of strongly positive APLA with BOH was told to her. Patient agreed for cesarean with SOS NICU care as against admission. She did not want prolonged stay in the hospital. Rather, she wanted delivery because she was very sure that her movements were less. This is the scan as well as the NST that we actually got out of her. This NST was done a day prior. You can see that there are small accelerations. Beat to beat was okay, but the next day it was almost like a flat line. And then you can see that the scan was roughly normal. The AFI was normal and the umbilical artery Doppler and everything was normal, but she continued to say that there were less fetal movements. And finally, we had an NST which was almost flat without any decelerations and also no accelerations. So the delivery and LSCS outcomes, preterm emergency high-risk cesarean was performed after 24 hours of the second dose of betamethasone and withholding low molecular weight heparin and aspirin for 24 hours. The operative findings was lower segment was not well formed, 4 waters were thin meconium stained, and LICA was just adequate. Placenta and membranes appeared partially separated. No RPH or PPH. 1.9 kg girl with Apgar of 6/10 and 8/10 at 1 minute and 5 minutes was extracted and stabilized by the NICU team. Postoperatively, patient was stabilized with low molecular weight heparin, administered 6 hours. After the procedure, antihypertensives was restarted, relevant labs within normal limits. Baby discharged after 3 weeks of an ICU stay that included 1 week step-down care exclusively for nursing. Probably she was going into an evolving abruption. And this question is to Dr. Shobha Goody. Enlist surveillance strategies, madam, apart from the usual, and monitoring APLA positive patients in the first, second, and third trimesters. That is apart from the usual. And can you please let us know whether we can map placental dysfunction, like what happened in this patient, accurately in APLA positive patients? And can biomarkers add value to surveillance in APLA positive patients prone to severe preeclampsia and adverse maternal and fetal outcomes? Yes, madam. Shobha Goody, madam.
Yeah, sorry about that. That is a well managed case, Revati. And though HCQS is actually enlisted as a second line drug, once ASA and LMWH has failed, you have started it proactively. It seems to have helped your patient. About surveillance strategies, I would go all out. Usually, what we do is we kind of mentally divide the surveillance into what is routine. The monitoring the underlying disease is the second part. The third is the maternal problems which can crop up. And the fourth is the intense fetal surveillance. The routine antenatal care has to be very much in place. All its preventive aspects, early pickup of anemia, of preeclampsia, of diabetes, everything has to go on. The fetal screening for anomaly, etc. has to go on. The first trimester screening, I would make it very comprehensive, as you have done. You have done the uterine artery Doppler. You have also done the aneuploidy screen. I would also do the PLGF and the PAP-A and factorize it to find out, how much is the risk, and would prefer to increase the dose of aspirin if that comes as positive. Okay, and you have listed all of that, and periodic screen for ascending infections also, of course, that also. What also is important in the first trimester, of course, whenever the surveillance strategies are done, it's important to see that she follows the medication very appropriately, whatever we have started. And then there are some baseline screening which is needed. For example, a platelet count should be available for us. It is recommended to have a urine protein creatinine ratio at the very outset. Also have liver enzymes. I think it is important to have a baseline because the underlying thrombotic disease should not be worsening. There is no saying that a woman who has never had a thrombotic episode may not have it in pregnancy. After all, pregnancy may exacerbate the underlying disease. So it's important to have that in place. And screening for growth restriction and placental dysfunction will have to start quite early, maybe as early as 24 weeks. And that is when, we can start charting the growth and kind of be very careful about monitoring. About the dosage of LMWH, it is, of course, the prophylactic dose which we give. And so far, unlike the unfractionated heparin, we don't have any guidance for, monitoring the INR or monitoring the anti-10A levels, etc. So we have to be more clinical. And it has happened occasionally that when we find onset of growth restriction early, maybe we should take a call for increasing the dose of LMWH. We need to be very sensitive about growth profiling the fetus. Anticipate preeclampsia, anticipate placental dysfunction. The debate where S-split values will help still remains an open question. But if you see derangement of urine protein creatinine ratio, if you see some elevation of blood pressure, if you see some urine albumin, maybe there can be a certain onset of severe preeclampsia since this patient had an earlier history. So probably we need to carefully individualize and see whether a split level will be necessary. And everything else related to routine management of pregnancy should be in place. What is important, I think, is to look for preterm delivery in these cases. On their own also they may happen. And also counseling regarding the need for iatrogenic preterm delivery. And maybe after 32 weeks, we need to step up the monitoring in terms of maybe weekly biophysical profile or at least an NST and a very strict kick count chart. Looking at the Leica, a modified biophysical profile may help, and Doppler studies at periodic intervals. In this case, the Doppler studies remained normal, and yet there was a need to terminate the pregnancy earlier. And therefore, that shows that placental dysfunction is not very, cannot be predicted that easily as otherwise in a pure case of preeclampsia, etc. So we need to be cognizant about that. So that is what I had to say. Yes, Revati, anything?
Yes, ma'am. I think
only one more thing, Revati, we should be doing some kind of biomarkers in this patient.
Yes.
Especially if you have got the point of care glycosylated fibronectin, it would have definitely picked up if this patient was going in for an accidental hemorrhage. So please use biomarker in these cases. It may help you to take a decision because it's not easy to take a decision to deliver at 32 weeks. And with a couple who has already burned their hand once, they are sitting on your head, asking you to do something. And Revati, one more small question from Dr. Lata was there. I think you should answer that now only. Why was she not induced and why was the section done? Justification.
Yes, sir. Actually, she complained of decreased fetal movements with the NST not looking so satisfactory. And she completely said that she did not have any fetal movements, sir. In fact, she came at around 10 o'clock in the morning. When we connected the NST, it was almost flat, but we did not find any deceleration, considering that she already had lost one baby and there was eclampsia. We couldn't have actually counseled her for an induction delivery. She wanted an immediate.
The patient's desire for cesarean was there, right? Patient also wanted an abdominal delivery.
Because with this kind of a patient, it is very difficult. They're not even willing for monitoring. They want delivery.
Sir, she was refusing to stay in the hospital, sir. She just wanted the baby out.
No, even if
induction delivery.
Yeah, because here
already will be longer.
See, here there's fetal distress and previous fetal loss, and then you're thinking of APLA positive.
Yes,
I think all those are indications if she doesn't enjoy it.
I may differ a little bit because we do get a lot of such patients. What we look at is, see, her liquor is fine and whatever, but what I also look at is sometimes this breathing movements, tone, those really help to take it. So again, you should individualize. As you said, this patient may not have agreed for a vaginal delivery.
I think that was the main reason in this case, maybe.
And here there was abruption, I think.
Yes, the placenta had partially separated. And the most important thing is she did not want any kind of admission. The previous day she resented, she went home taking the first steroid, and previously
the lesson would be that please sit with the couple, take their desire into consideration, and then move ahead.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely. And the thing is, within 2 hours of her loss of movement, she wanted the baby out. She was mentally
definitely, yes, agreed very much. Yeah.
See, many times. Go ahead, please. We have got one more case.
Yes, sir. And this is another important study, sir, which I wanted to discuss. This is predictors of pregnancy outcome in SLE and antiphospholipid APS PROMISE study. This answers to most of our questions, sir. And what this is trying to do is an observational study of 700 pregnant patients. It's still recruiting and enrolled at 9 major clinical centers all over the world. The purpose of the study is to determine whether certain proteins called complement split products that can injure healthy organs can be used. We've been using it in our practice like CRP and other things, and also along with complement split proteins can be used to predict poor pregnancy outcome in pregnancy with SLE and APLA syndromes, to determine whether elevated levels of circulating anti-angiogenic factors predict pregnancy complications in patients with APL as well as antibodies and or SLE. So this study will give us complete answers to all our questions. It could be a specific like complement split products to map at every stage of pregnancy and also to prognosticate using the anti-angiogenic markers.
Yeah, I think we'll have to wait for its results to come out.
Yes, sir. And it is actually recruiting right now, sir. It is August 2021. Now, the second case, with this, I think there is a lot of discussion that has actually in the mind. But with this, we move on to the next important discussion. She is a 38-year-old.
Mic a little closer,
please. Life 0, abortion 1.
Mic a little closer.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. At 36 weeks and 5 days, she is a known case of previous cesarean. She's currently an IVF FET conception. She's well booked, known case of gestational hypertension on capsudepin 10 milligrams morning, afternoon, and night since 22 weeks of gestation, with gestational diabetes on insulin with good glycemic control. HbA1c was 5.4%, and she was hypothyroid on thyroxine supplementation. And her current TSH was about 2.4 micro international units per liter. She presented to the MFM OPD with BP of 160/110 mmHg and epigastric burning sensation. Fetal movements were normal. PET profile showed platelet count of 1.2 lakhs per cubic millimeter and an LDH of 560 units per liter. Rest of the labs were normal. She was a known case of periconceptional hyperhomocystinemia. Homocysteine levels were 31 millimoles per liter. This was the intermediate positive hyperhomocystinemia. And she was also APLA negative. Her obstetric history, she is gravida 3, para 1, abortion 1. First pregnancy was an IVF FET conception. She had history of preeclampsia at 30 weeks. Fetus was suspected to have esophageal atresia with polyhydramnios. She was GDM only on diet control. This time she was on insulin. She was administered ecosprin and low molecular weight heparin only till 12 weeks of gestation, and later she was discontinued from both. She was on folic acid supplements throughout pregnancy, history of IUFD at 31 weeks. LSCS was done in view of breech and failed induction of labor. Intra-op short cord and retroplacental hemorrhage was present. It was a 1.9 kg boy, fresh stillborn, extracted, which was morphologically normal. Autopsy was not done. Then she had an abortion, which was again an IVF conception, IVF FET conception. She had a missed abortion at 8 weeks, and she was discontinued. Yeah.
No, here, even if they don't do autopsy, at least they could have done a scan, because it was obvious that baby had esophageal atresia.
Yes.
That confirmation.
It was done, madam. It was done, and it was suspected to have before the IUFD happened. We hadn't. Yes, ma'am.
Post-delivery fetal ultrasound. At least fetal ultrasound could be done.
Post-delivery fetal.
No, Revati, a placental pathology also would have helped there?
No, it was not done, ma'am. Yeah, that was actually not managed by us. It was done outside.
Okay. No.
And whatever is in the discharge summary has been noted here.
Yes.
Okay, fine.
Just saying, for the sake of discussion.
Yes, ma'am. She has not had any investigation on that after the IUFT was documented. Okay. But she just had, the esophageal atresia was by an antenatal ultrasound.
Yeah, that's what. So that needs to be confirmed because
that was
very
not done, ma'am. That was not done. Yeah, that was not done, ma'am. And then again, she had a missed abortion at 8 weeks and she was discontinued low molecular weight heparin at 7 weeks POG. This was also outside in view of subchorionic hemorrhage. And she was on diabetic diet and she was normotensive. The third pregnancy was managed in the current MFM unit. She is her homocysteine at booking was 10.3 micromoles per liter. She was on B6, B12 and folic acid supplements. Ecosprin 75 milligrams once daily and low molecular weight heparin 40 milligrams once daily continued from post-embryo transfer because this was again an IVF FET conception. She was on tablet amlodipine 5 milligrams twice daily from the first trimester in view of chronic hypertension. And she was also on closed and fetal surveillance with periodic scan blood tests and clinical reviews. Now, how will you manage this pastry where we have actually found out that she is hyperhomocysteinemic, she's APLA negative, she's had PE and an IUFT in the first trimester with suspected fetal anomaly and a missed abortion in the first trimester, and now she's
that's
pregnant.
More important, she had an accidental hemorrhage in the first pregnancy.
Yes, and now she's again pregnant and she's about 35 weeks and she's presented to you with high blood pressures. Do you feel hyperhomocysteinemia has contributed to progressive endothelial dysfunction? Dr. Sunita?
Yes, good evening one and all. So for this case, actually homocysteine levels was done in the periconceptional period after the first pregnancy loss. The first pregnancy itself, the woman has had a very bad outcome. Esophageal atresia contributing to an IUFT might not be the reason, but IUFT could be because of some placentation abnormality, which could have resulted in IUFT. So now we need to think of causes for abnormal placentation resulting in adverse maternal outcome, obstetric outcome. So homocysteine levels have been associated with adverse maternal outcomes. And one of the important adverse outcome which it has been found to be associated is with hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. The other outcomes are like meconium stain, like then intrauterine fetal death, preterm labor, and also a risk of abruption. So now what we know about homocysteine is that it is an intermediate amino acid which comes in the methionine metabolism. Actually, the homocysteine is an intermediate product where it needs to be converted to cysteine. And that sulfuration mechanism requires the presence of folate. And homocysteine levels, if in case, since it's an intermediate and it's an unstable compound, it needs to be also converted to methionine, for which vitamin B12 levels are required. Methionine also gets converted to homocysteine by the B6 vitamin. So what we see in the entire metabolism is that there is a dietary component which is involved in the homocysteine metabolism.
Dr. Sunita?
Sunita, I think you're muted. No, her net has dropped. All right, Revati, you can just show the articles.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, sir?
Yeah, you're fine.
So, the vitamins B6, B12 and folic acid are very much required in this homocysteine metabolism, and hyperhomocysteinemia is associated. So what was earlier thought of is the gene mutation, which is actually responsible for the high homocysteine levels. And that is why it was not taken much into consideration while taking it as a screening test for abnormal placentation. But what we know is, since diet is involved, it should be done. And in one study, which it has been quoted that almost like 80% of the women had some form of deficiencies of these vitamins, which could contribute to hyperhomocystinemia and the adverse outcomes. So we should include the dietary supplementation of B6, B12, and folic acid in such women, which has already been done. Now, considering the outcome or the management of this woman with hyperhomocystinemia, BP has to be managed. I don't know why amlodipine was started. Still, like we are with the conventional method of using labetalol or nifedipine for management of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. But however, any antihypertensive, like we should be cautiously using in such women. Here we need to treat her aggressively when she comes as an acute management for hypertensive disorders. So yes, anything else, Dr. Revati, you want me to speak? Dr. Revati?
Yes, Dr. Sunita. Let me just take, hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes. Revati, mic a little closer, please.
Yes, sir, it is. Yes, sir. Patient continued to have severe blood pressures even after 2 hours of presentation and administration of SOS dose of Depin. Considering she was administered prophylactic steroids for fetal lung maturity between 33 and 34 weeks of gestation, she was counseled. She was already previous cesarean. She has had a bad obstetric history, a difficult IVF FET conception. She was counseled for an emergency Caesar, and a 2.37 kg boy baby was extracted with good UpGuard. She also had a history of IUFD with accidental hemorrhage. And this baby was stabilized in the NICU, and post-operatively, patient was stabilized with low molecular weight heparin for 6 weeks and antihypertensives along with B6, B12, and folic acid supplements. Hello?
Yes, Dr. Revati, we can hear you.
Next slide, please.
Yes. So the next question here. So ultimately, this lady underwent a cesarean section, and a 2.37 kg boy was born, and the baby was stabilized in the NICU. Now, the most important thing which Dr. Sunita has brought up is we know that hyperhomocystinemia is pretty prevalent in our population also. Earlier, before 2010, it was only looked for in Caucasian population, and it was mostly considered to be a genetic defect. But in fact, this Indian study, which was published in 2010, clearly told us that it was not mainly because of a genetic problem. It was more of a B6, B12 deficiency, which exaggerated the prevalence of hyperhomocystinemia as well as endothelial dysfunction. Apart from that, we have a lot of studies coming from 2014 onwards, and we have a study which was published in 2017, which clearly said that there is the maternal serum homocysteine level has definitely a causal role in pathogenesis of preeclampsia. However, to recommend it as a routine test, larger studies are required. They've actually looked at women where homocysteine was measured and who also became preeclamptic. So apart from other factors, this definitely has a causal role, but we can't probably, uniformly ask for homocysteine levels in all women as screening for preeclampsia. The second important study, which Dr. Sunita has already brought up, is you have to look at homocysteine levels in the first trimester or periconceptionally. Prognostication with second and third trimester levels have still not been established. So serum homocysteine levels in late first trimester, that is 8 to 12 weeks of pregnancy, are significantly associated with prior pregnancy losses, particularly in the second and third trimesters, and with prior hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. With reference to the current pregnancy, increased serum homocysteine levels are also significantly associated with hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, pregnancy loss, oligohydramnios, meconium stain liquor, and low birth weight. However, raised homocysteine levels are not significantly associated with body mass index or the gestational diabetes and fetal malformations, neither in the past pregnancies nor in the current pregnancy. And this was actually published in 2014. This clearly answers all our questions. Then there was this study which has... Yes, ma'am.
Revati, can I say something here? It's very evident from all the studies that you have presented that hyperhomocystinemia is a definite, has got a cause and effect for preeclampsia, especially in Indian women, and it remains under evaluated as of now, right? Because most of our women who belong to this group cannot afford it. I think that there are many situations which get missed. They get missed because of, non-affordability. So we have to find out some measure in which routine is some kind of screening or some kind of testing can be implemented for pregnant women in the public sector as well for this particular country.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
very good suggestion.
Something should be done because see today screening for the neonate has advanced so much.
It's so expensive.
But for mothers, there is no
nobody cares.
Yeah, and then there must be some way in which we can overcome that gene polymorphism through dietary measures exactly how it is not established. Even Sunita brought out there so many times that it is something dietary. But you know, so many of our women, the diet is replete, yet they will have hyperhomocysteine. So therefore, and then the commonest prescription is B complex, isn't it? Even our general practitioners give so much, but then it is not helping. Yeah, so there has to be some strategy forward. This is not as simple as it sounds in these studies. For Indian population, I think we have to individualize this problem for our population, create more situations for studying it, and then finding a solution.
Absolutely, ma'am. And in fact,
I think Shobha, you brought out a wonderful point. But what, at least one clear carry-on message was that, say, hyperhomocystinemia was always thought to be MTHFR gene. In this particular patient, there was MTHFR gene positive. But what we need to remember is that if you have not an MTHFR gene, don't worry, because in Indian population, possibly it is not the genetic, but an environmental factor that is causing hyperhomocystinemia. So please look out for that. Try to, I know B1, B6, B12 we are giving to everybody, but we have to give it in the right dose. So you use B1, B6, B12. If you are not able to do the test, little help. It may not help you 100%, but I think even 30-40% of the help would be worthwhile.
Yes. And we've also...
Sir, actually one more point which I would like to bring out, sir, here. Sir, looking at large scale, like adverse maternal outcomes, maternal mortality, maternal morbidity and all that, including all these dietary modification very early in the stage of development of a girl. Adolescent. Yes, it might help to improve. Like actually, since madam is also there is an association of hyperhomocystinemia even with the cardiac defects, fetal cardiac defects, which has been brought out by one of the Satya Sai Foundation hospital, and now they are including for the all these dietary supplements to be given to the pregnant mothers, but rather than to the pregnant mothers, it should be an accumulative effect, and it should have the treatment and the preventive obstetrics should start very early in stage of the woman's life.
Absolutely, Sunita. What happens by the time the patient comes to us, we have already missed the bus.
Yes.
So all of us should be a little more careful and try to, from the time the girlhood start supplementing, then things would be better.
And the emphasis should be on preconceptional evaluation. And they've also, whether it is homocysteine or thrombophilia, the take-home message is there could be oxidative stress because of other reasons. So this is an interesting article which says that the increased homocysteine level in preeclampsia results definitely in endothelial dysfunction, but oxidative stress plays an important role in the pathogenesis of preeclampsia. So you have to identify other factors and aggressively manage them. So there is no one single factor which can contribute to preeclampsia.
One pertinent problem here, I'll just take a few more seconds, Prakash. What I needed to tell you is women who have hyperhomocystinemia are at actually higher risk of developing other medical problems. Actually, they are at higher risk than APLA positive.
Yes.
Okay. So it is a general health, initiative. Though it may be a rare condition, but I think it is important to know.
The long-term health is also important.
Madam, they have done a prevalence study, which I have not quoted here. This is in Pune, actually. That was not in pregnant population. They wanted to see what is the prevalence of hyperhomocystinemia in women of the reproductive age group. And they found 50 to 60% of these women were deficient and they had homocysteine, which was very high, but they were all intermediate positive, and some of them also had stroke later. So this actually clarifies the need for looking at
these like we should also get screened. Looks like Indians are more prone. All these women may not have the cardiovascular or cerebrovascular risk, but which women have, that is also it is something which we need to build up some research for Indian population. Definitely.
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we need to move a little faster because...
Yes, sir. I'll just take 2 minutes with the recent evidence, sir. We've covered most of it. I just wanted to put in these facts because these are something that will guide the clinical management. So this is all these studies have been published beyond 2010, mostly beyond 2015. This is a 2021 study which is trying to tell us that it's not just about inherited thrombophilia. Factors indicating an increased risk of progression from mild preeclampsia to severe preeclampsia are addition to inherited thrombophilia, the underlying pathologies, namely cardiac, hepatic, and endocrine factors. So these have to be taken care of. And this is a very important article which was actually published in 2014. And they said that the prevalence of APLA, though increased in women with preeclampsia, there is no association, just like how Shobha Gudi ma'am said, between APLA and preeclampsia in the study participants. Therefore, a routine assay of APLA, like how Sir said, in women at risk of preeclampsia may not be justified. However, women with preeclampsia with other clinical features of APLA should be investigated for APLA. This is a very, very enlightening study. Then we have another study which was in 2014, which supported the role of genetics. So they found out that factor 5 G1691A SNP and the prothrombin gene was associated with an increased risk for both preeclampsia overall and severe preeclampsia. We may be doing this a little later. We may be looking at, modifying the gene expressions. In conclusion, there is also a very important concept called seronegative thrombophilia. So this is an important study which came out in March 2020, and there is growing evidence to suggest a role for non-criteria APL in those patients. I don't have time to explain what happened in the study, but definitely they found that there was a value in starting or making starting heparin and ecosprin in these patients who are non-criteria APL. And this is another study which came out in 2018, and they said that the presence of thrombophilia leads to worsening of maternal laboratory parameters among patients with severe forms of PE, but without worsening perinatal outcomes. So patients who develop preeclampsia and are thrombophilic are more likely to develop HELP and other related complications compared to others. So it becomes so complicated because you have to manage the mother as well as the baby, which is preterm. So this is a study which has quoted the role of HCQS in stabilizing endothelial dysfunction, which probably helps to postpone the disease to some extent. And with all this evidence, bombarding us, and we are trying to, to find out what is best for our patients, I leave the stage to Sir to conclude it finally.
Yeah, thank you, Revati. I think we have had quite a good discussion on thrombophilia, and maybe the next virtual series should be on genetics and preeclampsia. Okay, so in conclusion, the diagnosis of thrombosis is similar to the diagnosis of anemia. Now, when I say it's anemia, it doesn't convey any meaning whatsoever unless I say what type of specific anemia it is. So same thing applies to thrombosis. And in addition to the characteristic clinical symptoms, the results of lab and instrumental studies are important to determine the cause of anemia and prescribe pathogenetically justified treatment. So same thing applies to thrombosis. All patients with thrombosis and obstetric complications during pregnancy or in history, could be personal, could be family, should be screened for hereditary forms of thrombophilia. So if there has been two factors, that is complications of pregnancy or thrombosis, please investigate them fully. That would be what will be required. Now, this will allow to determine the further tactics for the patient's treatment, its duration, and the choice of drug. It allows to prevent both thromboembolic and obstetric complications when planning a subsequent pregnancy. There is nothing worse than trying to carry on a pregnancy till a proper duration and then have a live baby and then have a pulmonary embolism for the mother. I've had two such cases, and let me assure you that those are the worst situations that you could land up with. So please be careful. Make sure that you treat it rather than go into that kind of a situation. The association between preeclampsia and thrombophilia remains somewhat unclear because of inconsistent data. We have got all kinds of articles. Some articles say do it, some articles say don't do it. So we are in a state of confusion, but please do it whenever there is a strong suspicion. No harm in doing it. Or even if you cannot do certain tests or you feel they're expensive, start her on aspirin, start her on LMWH if required, and I'm sure the results would be much better. Most studies found an association between thrombophilia and severe preeclampsia at less than 34 weeks of gestation, but not between thrombophilia and mild preeclampsia at term. Hence, routine screening for inherited thrombophilia is not recommended. Unfortunately, most of the articles try to show the relationship between preeclampsia and thrombophilia. They do not divide it into early preeclampsia and late preeclampsia. So that is why we have some kind of confusion going on here. But without any doubt, there is some relationship. We need to look for it whenever there are some, multiple factors associated, and definitely need to treat it. Next slide, please. Now, as far as preeclampsia is concerned, we have a time capsule. Now, preeclampsia poses enormous challenges, including the need to protect the mother's health and life while considering the risk of delivering the baby early. Building upon the recent breakthroughs, preeclampsia diagnosis, prediction, and prognosis will definitely be accurate and personalized. This is the word, personalized, by the year 2050. And at that particular time, we'll be harnessing the power of artificial intelligence technology. I'm sure me or many of the panelists may not be there at that time, but the youngsters over here will definitely remember our words, and you will see that the artificial intelligence...
Thankfully, we will not be there, Prakash.
And by 2050, our current comprehension of secondary hemostasis will have evolved into a complex global in vivo system. We are now looking at in vitro system. We'll be going into in vivo system, linking coagulation proteins in blood cells, endothelial cells, complement, and inflammatory proteins, thus changing our approach, prediction, and treatment of potential for placental-mediated pregnancy complications. Correct. So 2050 is going to be an exciting year. I hope we are there, but I don't think we'll be there. But all those of you who are there, please look forward to this 2050 outcomes.
Prakash, 2050 world population will be more than 12 billion.
Absolutely. So to put in words of Seneca, the man
many more women with preeclampsia.
Absolutely. So as Seneca has said, the man who anticipated the coming of troubles takes away their power when they arrive. So it should be our duty to anticipate the coming of trouble in any pregnancy. Then, they will take away their power of causing harm. Thank you very much for a patient hearing. I'm sure you'll all agree. Our panelists have been wonderful, very intelligent, with a lot of practical experience. They've contributed a lot to it. Thank you once again for being with us. And with this, I hand over the mic back to Dr. Chaitra.
I wholeheartedly thank the entire team of panelists and our moderators for taking us through such a wonderful session on thrombophilia and preeclampsia. I would now request Dr. Revati to speak a few words about the making of PENAI and take us through the PENAI project.
Just a minute, I'm just trying to put the slides.
Hello, Lata. I didn't say hi to you.
Dr. Lata left. I think she had gone.
She left, is it? Oh, so sad.
Yeah. She had
hi, Jayanti.
So she had told us by 3 she will have to leave.
Okay. I will log in from my mobile, Prakash. I'm on the
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very
much. Thank you for being there.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you so much, madam. I'm not able to swap it.
Yes, Revati, could we finish it?
Yes, sir.
Because the next meeting is coming up.
Yes, sir. We have to swap it. Okay, we just put it as full. Okay. Sir, I'm not able to make it full screen. I don't know. I don't have that.
No, doesn't matter. Please go ahead. Doesn't matter.
Ma'am, you can just click on enable editing once. That should do it.
Okay. Enable editing is
on top, Dr. Revati. Enable editing.
Yeah, it was showing then, but now it is not. So I think I will just.
No, doesn't matter. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, making of PENAI. So, what is pre-eclampsia education of the nation? India, certification course for practicing obstetricians and gynecologists in India using teaching modules with the latest updates on hypertensive disorders in pregnancy with special emphasis to preeclampsia. So this is a collaborative project by the SMFMI, that's the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine India, and ISSHP, that is the International Society for the Study of Hypertension in Pregnancy. So we've heard to thrombophilia and preeclampsia. We've been looking
at closer, please.
Preeclampsia through different perspectives, and so we need the best solution to this is education and empowerment, which we are planning to do through the PENAI program. What is okay now? Why PENAI? There is no clarity about the guidelines of classification systems and management protocol, just how we actually discussed now, for hypertensive disorders in pregnancy with particular emphasis to preeclampsia. Atypical presentations of preeclampsia can contribute to clinical dilemma, delaying the time of diagnosis, contributing to adverse maternal and perinatal outcomes. And challenges exist in extrapolating global research and guidelines into the indigenous population. So there is definitely a felt need to source and compile clinical research protocols. So we need to put all of them together so that we know how to implement these guidelines relevant to the Indian practice that needs to be addressed. There are many implementational issues in urban and rural settings as well. So that was why PENAI was evolved. When PENAI, the conception of the idea of PENAI started in August 2020, and the progress, we have established collaborations, we have sourced faculty from across India and abroad. We have actually structured project specifics. We have had people from the SMFMI office working tirelessly towards the formulation as well as propagation of the program. And we are also looking at course propagation strategies. The online launch was on the 22nd May 2021, which was on the World Preeclampsia Day. And we've already had about 17 registrations so far. And we've had about 3 successful people already who have completed the course. So the PENAI organizers, so of course, there's some problem with the transition. Okay, so this basically the program was launched by the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine India, along with the International Society for the Study of Hypertension in Pregnancy. And the organizers include Dr. Prakash, the Indian co-chairs, which is who is Dr. Prakash Mehta, the president of the SMFMI, along with myself, Dr. Revati, the secretary for the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine India. And we also have Dr. Sarosh Rana, who is the section chief of maternal fetal medicine from the University of Chicago. And she is also the global co-chair for the ISSHP. And she is representing as the global co-chair of the PENAI project as well. Then we have our supports from Roche, who have actually helped us by providing an educational grant. We also have had supports from the Medinet team as well as from the SMFMI office, who have worked tirelessly to get the project on. Why pilot? Currently, we are actually through the pilot run, where we have provision to register up to 200 delegates. So, and the idea is to concentrate on a small group of registrants so as to make the certification process more easier at the beginning. And the pilot should encompass 4 courses with 6 modules, each including the assessment. And each course can register up to 50 delegates. And to evolve, as to how we actually made this course, we had what is called the PENAI project implementation meetings. So we had brainstorming sessions with the concept builders and the Indian co-chairs. We've had actually up to 16 meetings, including some of the editing meetings that we did. Apart from the 10 major meetings, we did peer review of the content based on guidelines and evidence-based content scheduled for content finalization, which was a marathon and a Herculean task. So the office contributed a lot by putting things together from across the country and abroad into a course formulation. And then Medinet also gave us the platform by which we were able to host it effectively. So we did, the whole course is in the form of a module format. So this is entirely virtual, as when the delegate decides to enroll. At present, it is available for obstetrician gynecologists across the country. The modular format is on. So you have 5 modules, which are learning modules, which are given to start with. And once the delegate registers and enrolls to the course, he or she can look at the modules, learn through it for 6 weeks. And post 6 weeks, the delegate then decides to take the test. So you have an assessment module, which probably has both the objective type as well as the clinical case-based discussions incorporated in it. And we have a high task. We have a bar of about, we have a level of about 75% to pass out, before which we call the delegate to be certified. And a group of 50 certified delegates will then attend a virtual live session with the global as well as the Indian co-chair to put forth their real life clinical questions to be answered, which is a wonderful opportunity and which is probably the first of its kind of a situation in our country, because there is no comprehensive course which has been evolved till now, which includes learning, assessment, and a virtual live session. So the milestones achieved so far: we've had the faculty, we've had a team of speakers and concept builders, we've compiled the course, we've recorded the course, we've registered delegates. So strategies to reach out to delegates: we've done social media promotions, we've done word of the mouth propagations, as well as website propagation through the SMFMI, as well as the International Society of Study of Hypertension and Pregnancy. And finally, the future of our course: we want to navigate beyond the pilot to reach out to all the practicing clinicians across the country and beyond through collaborations, periodic module updates, which we plan to do to make the course more relevant. So we're going to have an updated module which will summarize what is the most recent, as a single module course. Then we want to empower clinicians with the latest evidence-based guidelines and research on preeclampsia who can contribute to reduction in maternal and perinatal morbidity and mortality. And we want to reach out to global organizations for extended support. So ultimately, we want to support preeclampsia research in the future, which will enhance quality of care in the country. So what we want to tell you is PENAI is a collaborative, comprehensive, evidence-based, virtual, modular course, which can probably help clinicians from all across the country to empower themselves to save many mothers who are on the verge of probably having preeclampsia and its complications. So join hands to save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Revati. I would now request Dr. Padmaja, who has been one of the concept builders of PENAI, as well as the assessment coordinator, to speak a few words and share her experiences with the making of PENAI. She's an eminent obstetrician and gynecologist and a favorite postgraduate teacher and examiner. She's a member of the BSOG CME committee, and she's the secretary of ANBI Karnataka. Over to you, Padmaja ma'am. Hello.
I think Dr. Padmaja might have joined through the other link. Is Dr. Padmaja on this group? Dr. Padmaja is there, but I think she has joined the audience group rather than the...
Okay. Probably...
Padmaja, please call Dr. Padmaja. Mahesh, can you please check whether Dr. Padmaja is in this group, please?
Ma'am, Padmaja ma'am is not in the Zoom platform.
Oh, she's on the group. I think she has joined the audience group rather than the faculty group.
Sir, I think, should we just give her a couple of minutes to join in if somebody can call?
Yeah, I'll call her up. We'll give her a couple of minutes to join.
Oh, okay, sir. Okay.
I think actually this was told by the office. Mahesh, can you please, I will forward Dr. Padmaja's number for your reference.
Okay, ma'am.
Till Dr. Padmaja joins, I think Dr. Padmaja has contributed a lot to the PENAI program. She has been like a pillar of strength with all the time attending all the meetings, giving us suggestions very well. And, unfortunately, due to some miscommunication, she seems to have joined the audience group.
Sir, we can take the questions, if any, sir, during this time.
I think probably the only question was regarding the route of delivery, with the first case, and we kind of discussed that it's probably the cesarean section which was done was, worth it rather than giving a long induction and a trial, especially with the apprehensive sort of a scenario with the patient and the previous pregnancy losses.
Yeah, I don't see anything much on this chat box.
Yeah.
For all of you who have joined, we will actually send an email with respect to PENAI correspondence details. So you can actually get in touch with the PENAI helpline and register yourselves. The course is open for registration only till it touches 200.
In the meantime that we are waiting, I would just like to, take the permission of the House to share one case which we're currently, we have admitted at BGS gyms. And as we discussed, most of the times the workup is incomplete, probably because the patient turns up late. So, somebody could just let me know once Dr. Padmaja is in. So
hello,
this lady,
yeah, I think
yeah,
she's joined.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Sorry for that technical issue. Yeah.
That's okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was hearing actually. I think with the audience. Yeah. So I think Dr. Revati, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Like Dr. Revati has said, the preeclampsia is a problem. I'll be very brief. So preeclampsia, like once we are busy practitioners, it's very difficult to keep up with all the latest developments and what is happening, what is the evidence is, all that for the practicing obstetricians. It's very, very difficult to keep up with all the updates. I think keeping that in mind, PENAI was started. There are 3 things which I liked about PENAI project. So I will just briefly tell about them. The first thing is because it is not just giving the latest research and latest developments, it is keeping in mind the low resource settings and those who are working in remote areas with Indian scenario. So the project is some of the talks are even based on that. So that those who are working in low resource settings also, so it will be very useful that way, because if you're talking only about latest research, many of them may not be interested. And the second thing is, it is endorsed by ISSHP. So there is a stamp of quality and also stamp of authority with that. And the third thing which personally I liked is, like I was part of the concept builder for making questions for the assessment. So each and every question what we made and each and every answer was thoroughly scrutinized by the entire team. And not only that, even all the talks were also thoroughly scrutinized by the entire team. So because of that, we had to do a lot of reading, and it was a great learning experience even for us also. So by the end of the by the end of the PENAI project, we became thorough, almost learned by heart all the guidelines. So that way, I think, that way it's a very thorough program, well thought out and thorough program. So if somebody who is sitting in some remote hospital with low resource settings, if they are able to manage preeclampsia in a better way after attending this course, I think the purpose of the course is served. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for those enlightening words. I'll just take a minute because I just started telling about the case that we had. So this lady is gravid of 4 and she presented at 29 weeks. The first 2 pregnancies, she mentioned she had intrauterine fetal demise at 8 months and preeclampsia. That's all, or high blood pressure readings. That's all she knows. She comes from a very remote village. The third pregnancy, I think, fortunately, she had a cesarean section around 34-35 weeks, and the baby is alive. And this time, she's directly landed up at 29 weeks, and with a scan showing absent end-diastolic flow in the umbilical artery, cerebral redistribution, but luckily, the ductus venosus forward flow is still there. So she is with us. She's just been steroided, and we're trying to buy 1 or 2 days to see if we can just push it a little forward and see how far it goes. So when such cases we encounter, we know the thrombophilia is lurking behind in the background. At this stage, maybe we may not investigate, but soon after delivery, we will try. Cost factor still remains a major issue, especially in medical colleges or in the rural setup. So with this, I think as time is drawing to a close, I would like to propose the vote of thanks and thank each one of you today who has made this event very memorable and a source of great enlightenment to all of us. Our sponsors require special thanks, and they are Roves Life Sciences Private Limited and BioWarriors Pharmaceuticals Private Limited for their wholehearted support. Of course, we need to thank the Medinet team who have always been with us and have given us this platform for all our meetings and as well as for the Penai project. My wholehearted thanks to our esteemed panelists and of course our moderators for putting in together such interesting cases and with so much of details that we could learn from almost each and every sentence and each and every data that was given to us throughout the panel. Last but not the least, I thank each one of you present here, the SMFMI members and the growing number of SMFMI members, because it is each one of you who contributes to the society as well as the society, the Maternal Fetal Medicine Society and the society in India at large to help and improve the health of women and, bring in a new dimension in taking care of women and the being born new child. Thank you so much, all of you, for your patient hearing, and we hope to see you soon in all our upcoming academic programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chaitra, for being such a wonderful MC for this program.
Thank you so much.
Before we really sign off, I would request all the concept builders to please join through the faculty link for the second meeting that we are likely to have. Yes. And of course, I take this opportunity to thank the delegates who are coming in larger and larger numbers for the SMFMI meetings. Thank you all very much because you keep up the enthusiasm of all the youngsters in my team and make them do more wonderfully well. Thank you very much.